Hey, United Methodist Men, my name is Odo Horn. I am the president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men, and I want to welcome you to this very special conversation for Black History Month. We're going to be talking about Christianity from Ethiopia all the way up to Carthage. And these are areas that are sometimes overlooked when we talk about Christianity in Africa. In the antiquity, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. We have two very special guests. We have Vince Bantu. He is the assistant professor of church history and Black church studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. And David Wilhite. He's a professor of Christian theology at Baylor University. Gentlemen, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with David. I want you to introduce yourself more formally. Tell us where you got your education, how you became, what is your research interest, and how you became interested in that research, and then do the same with Vince. And then we'll have a conversation starting with Vince on this Ethiopia to Carthage. But we'll start with David.
Sure. Well, my education was at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And there I worked on Tertullian of Carthage. He's the first North African writer. He's more famously known as the first Latin writer for Christianity. And because of that, he's sort of been stereotyped, and a lot of assumptions have been made about him. In the last several years, a lot of people have revisited him and realized that the only thing we really know certainly of his life is that he writes from Carthage, mentions Africa a lot. It's part of his identity. And so I explored that in my doctorate a few years ago now, and since then that project has kind of continued to grow, where I've studied the North African Christian writers all the way up to the time of Islam. But I teach at Baylor in theology in general, and especially focus on early Christian studies and sort of the development of main ideas of canon and Christology and Trinitarianism. But again, my research area is this area of ancient North Africa.
David, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Georgia, South Georgia, right on the Alabama border. Yep.
Okay, all right. Welcome to our conversation. Vince, same thing. Tell us where you got your doctorate degree from. Tell us your academic journey. That's a very interesting conversation. Tell us your academic journey and then your research interest as well.
Yeah. So I did undergrad at Wheaton College in theology, and then also I did seminary, MDiv at Gordon Conwell, and a THM at Princeton Seminary. Then I went on. I got interested during that time in early African Christianity, and went on to do another MA and a PhD at the Catholic University of America in Semitic and Egyptian languages, focusing on Coptic and Syriac. And since then, I've started adding to the repertoire, kind of my research interest is and Old Nubian and classical Arabic. And so, and I teach at the, Fuller Seminary in Black Church Studies, and also direct the Meacham School of Hymenot, which is an Afrocentric biblical theological seminary. So yeah, that's just some of the highlights, but I'm sure we'll get into more.
Amen. Thank you for that. What I'm going to do then is, and Vince, where are you from? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. On the west side, and that's where I live, and also do ministry as well.
Okay, all right. So we're going to start with Vince. Vince is going to talk to us about Nile River Valley civilizations. And for those of you who do not know, the Nile River flows north to south, starting around Lake Victoria, and goes all the way up to, flows, did I say north to south? South to north, starting with Lake Victoria, and then flows up to the Mediterranean. And he's going to talk to us about the civilizations along the Nile River and their the influence Christianity had on those civilizations. Thank you, Vince.
All right. So, as Odell mentioned, I'll just do a quick little highlight of, some of the Christian civilizations along the Nile River. To start off with, I'm going to just kind of go north to south, and then I think David will follow up and tell us a lot more about North Africa. But, starting in Egypt, We're talking about the Nile River Valley, especially in antiquity. The main areas to really know about are Egypt and Nubia and Ethiopia. So to just say something briefly about all of them is that one thing I think that's really interesting is that Christianity was the dominant faith and religion in all of those Nile Valley civilizations during up until by the end of late antiquity and throughout the medieval period. These communities were predominantly Christian, and that Christianity entered into these places freely long before Islam and from the very beginning of the church. And that it was free from any kind of colonialism or oppression, or it wasn't forced in Africa in the Nile Valley, but it came in freely. And then the last thing I would say that's a general characteristic of all of these contexts is that far from the idea of Christianity somehow being antithetical to African identity and African languages and culture, Christianity actually gave birth to African culture, literature, architecture, civilizations, and music. And it's impossible to study African civilizations and African history without studying Christianity. To study African history during late antiquity and the medieval period is to study Christianity, because it was actually African Christians who produced the most amount of written and material evidence from the continent of Africa. And so to start with Egypt, Egypt was actually a province of the Roman Empire. And we see Christians mentioned in Egypt in the New Testament that believers from Egypt were present at Pentecost. Jesus and Mary and Joseph lived in Egypt as refugees in the first years of our Lord's life. And the gospel went in quickly. The tradition says through the apostle Mark that Mark came to Egypt and brought the gospel and built the church. And soon after that time in the 2nd century, we see seminaries that are mentioned, popes in Egypt. In fact, the word pope was first used in Egypt. The first historically verified pope was Demetrius in the late 100s. And then we also see the School of Alexandria, which was a seminary in Egypt and produced theologians like Clement of Alexandria and Origen. And then in the beginning of the 4th century, when Christianity became dominant in the Roman Empire, you also had monasticism that was born out of Egypt primarily. It was in other places, but some of the most famous monks were from Egypt. And people like Anthony the Great and many of the desert mothers and fathers. And also Pachomius, who I have a quote from here. Pachomius actually invented the communal style of monasticism that was different than the solitary or eremitic style that Anthony was known for. And also Pachomius represents when Christian literature started to be written in the Coptic language, especially Orthodox Christian literature, beginning in the late 3rd and early 4th century. And this is actually a quote from Pachomius's biography that talks about how he was born and raised in Thebes, which was the former capital of Egypt. And he was raised by parents and a family who practiced the traditional Egyptian religion. But it shows that even from a young age that he was dedicated to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the story says that as a child, Pachomius's parents took him with them somewhere on the river to sacrifice to the creatures that are in the waters. When those creatures raised their eyes in the water, they saw the boy and they took fright and fled away. Then the one who was presiding over the sacrifice shouted, "Chase the enemy of the gods out of here so that they will cease to be angry with us. For because of him, they do not come up." At once his parents reproached him, "Why are the gods angry with you?" The boy signed after God and went away home. Another day, they brought him with them to the temple, where they were going to offer a sacrifice. After the sacrifice, they gave him a drink of the wine they had poured out for the demons. But at once he vomited it out vigorously, and his parents were distressed about him because their gods were hostile to him. So we see that from the beginning, Pachomius was dedicated to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this is, I think, a very interesting counterexample to many, especially in the African-American community, who we have religions and communities that are presenting the idea that Christianity is a copy or an imitation of Egyptian religion. But this really shows that actually Christians and traditional Egyptian religious practitioners saw themselves as very distinct, and that their religious practices were very different from one another, and that Christians presented themselves as a different religion that was not a copy or an extension of it. And this is actually a text that was written in the Egyptian languages. Many of the ideologies and texts that Kemetic or conscious communities will use to fabricate these myths actually come from European and Euro-descended sources, but this is actually African sources showing that Egyptian Christians and Egyptian traditional religious practitioners saw each other as very different.
Vince, let me stop you right there real quick. Explain to me explain the United Methodist Men, the Kemetic and the Afrocentric religions real briefly.
Yeah, so the Kemetic movement, sometimes it's called the Kemetic or the conscious movement. It was actually started by white Americans, these white North Americans who pray to Egyptian gods and try to reignite the Egyptian religion. and it was ironically exclusive towards Black people. And one of the first Black North Americans, actually originally from the Caribbean, a man named Ra Nefer Amen, he was rejected by the white Kemetic community, so he started a religious community for Black people in New York City in 1974. And there's lots of denominations and variations of it, but I would just quickly say that the common thread among the Kemetic or conscious community is a belief in kind of a syncretistic blend of praying to a lot of Egyptian gods, Horus and Isis and Ra, and trying to reincarnate or bring back the ancient Egyptian religion, albeit in their own 21st century kind of way, which is often not very much reflective of what we see in pyramid texts and all of that. But they draw upon pyramid texts, Book of the Dead, but they also embrace Buddhism, Hinduism, all kinds of faiths, but they're very against Christianity because their belief is that Christianity was introduced to Black people by the white man as a tool of oppression, and that it's a white man's religion. And also that, which is actually kind of contradictory, because their other main claim, which contradicts the first, is that Christianity is a copy of Egyptian religion. Now, how can Christianity be a copy of an African religion and yet be a white man's religion? If it's copying an African religion, then it's not a white man's religion. But also, that's not a way that ancient people thought about religion. In fact, Egyptian religion embraced the idea of copying and blending and mixing gods together. They would mix Egyptian and Greek gods and Canaanite and Nubian gods, and so that's a very modern way of thinking about it. But also the idea, and I go into this more actually in a chapter in the new book, Urban Apologetics, where I kind of go through some of their central claims and show from history how they're really untenable. But also many of the claimed similarities, like between Horus and Isis being the mother and son god, and Jesus and Mary, are not actually true and not even reflected in Egyptian pyramid texts. There's very little that the two have in common with one another. And so, but yeah, there's also a new podcast with the Jew 3 Project called The Bisrat, and we have a whole episode where I actually dialogue with an actual practitioner of Egyptian religion who's not a Christian and yet also agrees with me that these ideas that Christianity is somehow an extension of Egyptian religion is completely historically untenable. But yeah, that's just a little bit about them. And then, again, I think another thing to see, of course, from the Word of God, but even from history, we see that Egyptian language and culture and literature was very much Christian, and it did not see itself as an extension of traditional religion. Another example is Shenouda of Atrib. Shenouda was another Egyptian writer. In fact, he is the greatest writer in the history of the Egyptian language. And so if people really want to go back to Egypt or try to reclaim or reconnect with Egyptian language and literature, then they're going to find that actually the greatest writer in the history of the Egyptian language was a Christian named Shenouda, who was a theologian. And he led a monastery that was a very, I think, great example of holistic ministry, because he was preaching the gospel, discipling, but he was also creating jobs and housing in southern Egypt, or Upper Egypt as it's called. And he was actually engaged in prophetic engagement of the wealthy and the privileged who were oppressing the poor. In this excerpt from one of his public sermons, he publicly denounces wealthy landowners, and he says he's praying on behalf of the people, saying, have mercy on your people, patient one, whose mercy is great, and rescue them from the hand of those who oppress them. And he goes on, but I think Shenouda is also a great example, not only of ancient African and Egyptian Christian literature. I think that can't be overstated, is that the greatest writer in the history of Earth's oldest language was a Christian theologian, and yet his name is largely unknown. So he needs to just be known for world history, and of course for African history, and also for church history. But also, I think he's an encouragement in that he represents a more holistic approach to ministry that doesn't divorce social practice from orthodoxy, orthopraxy from orthodoxy, but he represents a wholeness of those things embodying together. And then I would say briefly a little bit about Nubia. There's many more Egyptian people, but these are just some highlights. But with Nubia, Shenouda, who I was just talking about, actually talks about how he housed many Nubian refugees as a result of a war going on in Nubia, which was south of Egypt, in what we now call Sudan. And there were many refugees that came over into Egypt that lived in his monastery, and he says actually became Christians. And so in the 400s, when Shenouda lived, that was one of the earliest mass conversions of Nubians, and then in that way, sub-Saharan Africans to the Christian faith in the 400s. And then in the 500s, that was when we learned from a Syrian historian named John of Ephesus that the Nubian king actually embraced Christianity as the national religion of Nubia. And again, it was through connections with Egyptian monks. And so this is also significant to see that as the gospel was spreading in Africa, it was through Africans evangelizing other Africans. And this is actually a picture on the bottom left of the capital of Nubia, which was called Dongola. And it's the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa in the medieval period. There's the Nile River in the background, and you see some of the pillars there. These are various churches that were left. And when you go to Dongola, which was the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa, what you see is primarily Christian churches. And so that's an example, a living example of what I talked about when I said that Christianity literally gave birth to African architecture and African literature. We talked about the greatest writer in the history of Egypt, of the Egyptian language, was a Christian. And when you go to Dongola, what you mostly see is churches and monasteries. And also this I show a painting here that's from the inside of a monastery in Dongola, and it's a nativity painting. You see on the top left, that's a picture of Mary and Jesus. And then in the central picture, you see a group of Africans that are worshiping Jesus, celebrating the birth of our Lord in the Nubian language, but also in other languages that the Nubians couldn't really understand. And you also see from their dress and their musical instruments, the dashikis, and also the animal masks you can see on a couple of the figures on the bottom. And I zoomed in on the right picture. You can see the figure on the right is wearing an animal mask, which is something that is very common to many Central and West and South African cultures, but it's not common to Nubian culture. So what this shows us is that Nubians were reaching other Africans even outside of the Nile Valley as well, so that the gospel went all along the Nile, up the Nile from Egypt to Nubia to Ethiopia, and then it went out further from there into Central and West Africa. So even as far as West Africa, Christianity had reached there long before colonialism. And then the final thing I'll make a couple of comments on is Ethiopia, further south or further up the Nile, depending on how you look at it. And Ethiopia also became a Christian nation freely and independently without colonialism in the 300s, actually before Nubia, even though it's further to the south. But Ethiopia used to be called Agaze, and the capital was Axum. And it was along the Red Sea, so it had participated ever since, for centuries before that, in the Indian Ocean trade and in the Red Sea trade for a long time. But in the 300s, there was a king named Ezana, and Ezana came to meet a Syrian missionary named Frumentius. And it's interesting because oftentimes people will say that Christianity began for Black people in slavery. And in a way, that's kind of true, but not in the way we think, because at least in the case of Ethiopia, Christianity did begin in a way through slavery, only it wasn't the Africans who were the enslaved, but it was the Africans who were the slave owners. And it was actually a non-African who was the slave and who was a Christian. But Frumentius was a Syrian Christian who was shipwrecked in Ethiopia and was raised as a slave in the imperial capital. And then he shared the gospel with King Ezana, and Ezana freely embraced Christianity and adopted Christianity as the national religion of Ethiopia. And then he allowed Frumentius to go free, but Frumentius did not want to go back to his native Syria. He actually went to Egypt and talked to Athanasius, who was another one of the most prominent early church theologians in Egypt. He was the Pope of Egypt, and he was actually at this same time was suffering persecution because of his defense in the Orthodox belief of the full divinity of Jesus Christ. In the 300s, in the Roman Empire, people were arguing about whether or not Jesus was fully God. And there was a person named Arius, and he had a bunch of followers called Arians, and they were saying Jesus wasn't really God. And then the Nicene Creed said that Jesus is God. But then after that, Emperor Constantine was kind of being wishy-washy on it and was sending Athanasius into exile. And then Constantius, Constantine's son, was strongly promoting Arianism in the Roman Empire. And so, but when Frumentius went to Egypt, he linked up with Athanasius and told him about how the king of Ethiopia was a Christian. And with Athanasius's blessing, Frumentius went back to Ethiopia and became the first abuna, or the first bishop of Ethiopia, and under King Ezana's blessing, helped to grow the church of Ethiopia. And Constantius, the Roman emperor, heard about this, and he actually tried to send word in Ethiopia threatening them that they, as they were becoming Christian, that they specifically had to be Arian Christians. But the king of Ethiopia rejected this, and they embraced Orthodox Christianity and in league with Athanasius and the Egyptian church, which also was suffering persecution as they were a Roman colony. So you have a persecuted African colony in Egypt, and then you have an independent Black African, sub-Saharan African nation that are both predominantly Christian and that are linked up in orthodoxy in the mid-300s at the same time when the emperor of the continent we now call Europe, or the Roman Empire, was actually under heretical beliefs or Arianism. And we can know from Ethiopian evidence, and again, Christianity gave birth to African civilization. Some of the earliest inscriptions in the Ge'ez language are actually King Ezana's inscriptions, which you see a picture of on the bottom right. And in his inscription, he says he believes in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then notice what he says towards the end. He says that he actually went to war against Nubia because Nubia was apparently oppressing other surrounding African groups. But then look what he says. He says, I rose up in the power of God Christ. So Ezana calls Jesus God. And so you have in one of the earliest African inscriptions, period, you have a declaration of the full divinity of Jesus Christ at a time when European leadership was actually espousing the opposite belief, that Jesus was not God, at least in the case of the emperor. And so that's a little bit about how Christianity came into Ethiopia, but I'll also just point out that about almost 1,000 years later, Ethiopian Christianity had a renaissance or a renewal, and the Ethiopian church started to produce architecture and literature and paintings at an unprecedented level. The most famous of which is the famous rock churches of Lalibela, which you see a picture of on the left right there. And that church and all the other churches of the capital of Lalibela were carved out of one giant piece of rock. They weren't stitched or nailed together, but that entire church building is carved out of one piece of rock into the ground. And this is a style of architecture that is unparalleled in the world, and is uniquely African and uniquely Christian at the same time. And Ethiopian and Christian identity just went together. You have the king of Ethiopia, Zeinab, saying that the people of Ethiopia are gracious and lovers of religious education, even more than the peoples of Rome and New Rome and Greece and Constantinople. Zeinab says about his own nation, the faith of the people of Ethiopia is as bright as the sun. And you also see prayer books. This is a prayer book from a monastery in Ethiopia that goes back to the 6th century. And you see paintings and pictures of Jesus and Mary and angels where they reflect African features and African hair and skin color, showing that Ethiopians understood that Black people were made in the image of God. And then also the last thing I'll mention is that even as Christianity was growing along the Nile Valley, most of Christianity was part of what's now called the Orthodox faith or branch of Christianity. But one thing that's very interesting is that there was actually a Reformation movement that started in Ethiopia long before John Wesley or John Calvin or Michael Sattler or Martin Luther started their Reformation movements in Europe. There was a monk named Stephanos who started a Reformation movement in Ethiopia long before that, in the late 13 and early 1400s, a century before Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses. Stephanos was a monk, and this is actually a quote from his Gadla, which is an Ethiopian word for like a spiritual biography that's meant for liturgy and history and ancestral stories and all of that put together. And it talks about when he became a monk and he dedicated himself to the Lord, saying, by you I was strengthened in the womb of my mother, you are in my remembrance at all times. And then Stephanos set out to actually teach different from the dominant Orthodox Church. He was teaching things like the Christians should not be bowing to the king should not have interference with ecclesial affairs, that they shouldn't be bowing to images of Mary or praying to Mary, that they shouldn't be putting church teaching at the same level as scripture. Many of the same things that Martin Luther was arguing for in Europe, but a century later. And again, Stephanos was strongly persecuted. He was actually killed by the king of Ethiopia, and his movement was strongly persecuted. But even to this day, among Ethiopian believers who are not part of the Orthodox Church, they're called Pente or Protestants, to use the Western term. Many of them still hold Stephanos as a saint and really as the first original African reformer. And so this is just a quick highlight of some of the kind of main players and some of the dynamics of how Christianity spread along the Nile Valley civilizations.
Vince, I want to thank you for that. I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, you mentioned the churches of Lalibela, and I just want to talk to United Methodist Men. 60 Minutes did at least one, maybe two stories about the churches of Lalibela. One I think was back in 2020, 2019, 2020, and then they may have done one before that. And then you mentioned something about Ezana, King Ezana, and Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Africa's Great Civilizations on PBS. He did an episode called The Crescent and the Cross, and he talked about the very same things that Vince Bantu has talked to us about in King Ezana, Axum, as well as some of the Frumentius, the Syrian slave in the Ethiopian court, as well as in Alexandria is also. So those are some secular sources, 60 Minutes, and Africa's Great Civilizations on PBS with Henry Louis Gates Jr. to verify the claims that Vince Bantu, professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, has just made. And we're going to talk to him. Thank you, Vince, for that presentation. We're going to talk to you some more. I want to get to David Wilhite and his presentation. He's going to take us across the other side of Egypt, probably Libya, all the way up to Carthage. David, what do you have in store for us?
I'm going to follow Dr. Bantu, but take us western to Western North Africa. And so if you look at a map today of Africa, what we would think of as Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, this is what most scholars are talking about when they say North Africa, because in the Roman Empire, this is a map that kind of shows some of the provinces as Romans would see it. Egypt was sort of its own unique place, its own unique culture. But if you look to the middle of that map, the area named Africa, that's the actual province that the Romans called Africa. The technical name was Africa Proconsularis. And it was thought to be named after a people group that ancient prehistoric Romans ran into, called the Afri, the Africans. And so the region became known by that. But even though there was one province known by this, and you have all these other provinces alongside it, it was also common to speak of the whole continent, the whole region, as Africa. So anyone from this whole side of North Africa would be called Africans. I've also got this word, you see Libya at the bottom. That's not talking about modern Libya. That the Greek writers from the Greco-Roman period tended to call everything beyond Egypt to the west Libya. And so what they would call Libya, the Romans would call Africa, and sometimes these words are interchangeable. But we're going to see this actually comes up in it can be seen in even our early Christian sources from this area. If you go to North Africa today, you'll see lots of evidence of Romanization, Roman colonization. This is the amphitheater that was built in Carthage. This is the exact site where Perpetua and Felicity were martyred. You can visit these sites today because they're hardly really attended to. This is another amphitheater further south in Tunisia that the floor has been rebuilt, so you can kind of get a sense of the scope and the power of Rome in these places. It would have been formidable. But if you go, you also find that it's not just ancient Roman military sites and colonization sites. You find a lot of Christian sites, like this ancient Christian basilica. And just to even give you a sort of a sense of how many there are, I've taken that map I showed you before, that what I've put in a square there at the bottom. One early French archaeologist, I say early modern French archaeologist named Duval, tried to document all the known Christian church buildings in just this one region of North Africa. And it's hard to see all the little dots there, so I've kind of tried to highlight them. That's not 100% accurate because there's even more than I could put with those dots. These are simply the known church sites in this portion of North Africa. We know from literary texts hundreds more that just haven't survived, and how many more were meeting from house to house or in church buildings that didn't survive for whatever reason. So when you go to think of, like, if you were to go to North Africa, or you think of the landscape of North Africa, you should think of it as thoroughly Christianized. So just to give a very rough outline of our history, long before the Christian era, this part of North Africa is colonized by the Punic Empire, and that's what we would think of as Phoenician from Old Testament literature. The Romans or Latins called them Punics, and you remember the Punic Wars and Hannibal marching his elephants over the Alps. Eventually, Rome conquers the Punic Empire and colonizes North Africa beginning in 146 BCE. And Rome rules throughout the Christian era until there's a short time where what we normally think of as the fall of Rome and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Vandals invade in the 400s. They rule for 100 years until the Byzantines reconquered. And we call them Byzantines. At the time, they would have been called Romans. They're ruling from Constantinople. until the time of the spread of Islam. And around 700, that's when we see Western North Africa begin to be conquered by the Arab armies. And at that point, we start to see a pretty steep decline in Western North African Christianity, and eventually its disappearance. So that's just a rough outline. But if you were to think about what you see in the Western North African regions for Christianity, I like to compare it to things like what Dr. Bantu just talked about in Egypt. Many other people are studying Syriac Christianity from ancient times. There's still a Syriac church today that speaks Syrian. So if you were to go to ancient Syria, you would expect to find what would appear to us as a somewhat exotic and foreign expression of Christianity. Or in Egypt, in Coptic Christianity and in Ethiopian Christianity, if you were to study the sources, you would expect there to be something unique about the culture there that's expressed even in the Christian sources. And that's because they're speaking in their own unique languages. Well, the problem when you do this with the North African Christian writers is that they're all writing in Latin. And so this has just made it far too easy for Western European scholars to assume that they're all Latin Romans. And in a sense, they are Latin. They're Latin speakers. In a sense, they're Romans. They're the member of the Roman Empire. But in another sense, there's also just as much unique African culture and expression found in these sources if you know what to look for. So those historical periods I gave you, I think it's fascinating that what happens is you just add layer upon layer. So the very last period, we think of a sharp break between Christianity and Islam, when in fact, we've discovered mosques from North Africa that have icons of Jesus in them, which you're not supposed to do in traditional Islam. But in these early overlaps of the different people groups and cultures, you can see how much this was originally a church that was simply converted to a mosque. When you think of North African writers from the region I'm talking about, many people would know some of these names. These are some of the most influential Christian writers from the ancient church in general. Tertullian, Cyprian, especially Augustine. Most people have heard of Augustine. They're all North African writers. These images, there's a lot to be said about these images, by the way. They're all from the internet. Tertullian has never been pictured in antiquity. So here's someone drew him as very grumpy. And that's probably true of his personality. But in addition to these sort of well-known writers, there are dozens and dozens of other African writers, Christian writers. These are just some of the key examples. And one of the things I mentioned the Latin language, I think it's important to point out is that these names look like Roman names, like Latin names. And often they are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who bears this name is Roman and not African. So for example, we have this writer, Paulus. This is not the Apostle Paul. In all likelihood, he's named after the Apostle Paul. He's a later Roman Christian from North Africa. But it's a good example because the Apostle Paul, Paulus, is a Roman name, but we know that the Apostle Paul also has his Hebrew name, Shaul or Saul. Now, just because Paul has a Roman name doesn't mean he's not Jewish. In fact, he tells us he's a Hebrew of Hebrews. So here's the Apostle Paul, who's a Hebrew of Hebrews, speaks Greek, has a Latin name, Latin citizenship. We should assume the same about other Christians from antiquity. And so you look at someone like this and you have to imagine that just because they had this Latin name doesn't necessarily rule them out as being African. The same is true here. This is a lesser known figure, Quod Vult Deus. He's writing just after the time of Augustine. And if you know Latin, this literally means what God wants. So probably something like the will of God is his name. And that's curious because Romans did not put that sort of God in their name like Greeks do. We think of like Luke and Acts are dedicated to Theophilus. Theophilus in Greek means beloved of God. You find that in Greek writers, you find that in all sorts of Mediterranean cultures. You rarely find sort of a God name put into Latin writers. So this is probably a Punic name or some African name just Latinized. One more to compare with that, Augustine's own son, if you've read his Confessions, you know that Augustine, before he had a conversion, had a concubine and actually had a son by her. And even when he converted and devoted himself to celibacy and sent his concubine away, his son grew up with him and was a devoted Christian as well. This son's name is Adeodatus. And the Latin is, to break it down, Adeo, from God, datus, a gift. So his name means a gift from God. And maybe this is just a Latin name, but in reality, it's not a common Latin name. So where does Augustine get this from? It's a perfect parallel to the Punic name. if again, Punic is a cognative Phoenician, which is a related language to Hebrew. So if you know your Hebrew word for grace, Hana, a gift is Hana, and Baal can mean the god Baal, or it can just mean a god, like a lord. So here we have the Punic general Hannibal. His name means gift of God. And it's striking that Augustine, or perhaps Augustine's Punic concubine, would name his son after Hannibal, only in a Latinized form. And then here's the very last thing I'll give you just to kind of illustrate this. Lactantius is a writer just from before the time of Augustine. He's writing at the time of Constantine. This looks like a Latin name, but it cannot be a Latin name. I mean, because it would literally mean one who lactates. And I promise you, this guy was not nursing, okay? So why has he got this name? It is a Latinized name of some form, and scholars have argued that this is a Punic name that has just had a Latin ending added to it, and we've kind of lost the meaning of that Punic word. Augustine knows of Latin names. In fact, there's a letter that survives where a Christian in a town nearby has been making fun of some of these other Christians, and he makes fun of their African names. So I'll read you this quote. He says, "As an African man writing to Africans," and there's the Latin of how that looks, "and even as one abiding in Africa, you could not have forgotten yourself and thought of Punic names as flawed." And then he goes on to give all this other about how Punic books still survive, Punic language still survives, Punic is a proud culture. And Augustine has sermons where he uses Punic words to explain Hebrew words to his audience. There's letters where he's frustrated because he can't find enough people to preach in the Punic language, like his rivals, the Donatist Christians, are doing. And he knows people in his area want to hear the gospel in Punic, and most of his people are speaking in Latin. So Augustine is a good illustration of someone who can navigate this African identity as a Christian, even if that's not always, if they're speaking as Christians, their Africanity may not always be at the forefront of what they're saying. So again, let me kind of give another illustration of what this region would have kind of had as its symbols. This is a mosaic taken from North Africa. You can still visit it there in Tunisia, in the museum there. Lots of figures there, and I'll zoom in on the one in the middle. This is clearly some sort of goddess of war with all of her instruments. Maybe it looks like Athena to people who know their Greek deities, but it's not. This is Roma, the spirit of Rome herself, armed with war for conquest, and she holds in her hand the orb of the world. And that's important because you see these other images are other regions, their spirits symbolized, but notice here, Rome is the center of the world for them. And if I won't go to all of these images, but here's one of Egypta, the spirit of Egypt herself. She has an Isis rattle, a traditional mystery cult from Egypt. Much has been made of her hairstyle. It's made into dreadlocks. And then there's another figure here, and the clue is not so much in her appearance, but in the headdress. That's actually a mask that's been pulled back. And so you can see there the tusks at the top and the trunk. That's an elephant face mask, the ritual mask that's been pulled back to reveal here Afra herself, the spirit of Africa. And remember Hannibal and his elephants. The elephant is always the spirit of Africa for Romans, so the symbol of Africa. In this same region, there was another mosaic found. This is it, that has just Afra herself. And if you zoom in, it's the same headdress, but without the tusks. And I'm not sure what the significance of that is. But again, she has dreadlocks. There's much that's been made of her facial features and what this means. Lots of scholars have debated all of this. But my point is simply to ask, why is there a house here that has a mosaic with Rome at the center in one image? Rome's dominance is acknowledged. And yet there's another image where Afra herself takes center stage. I think this must tell us something about the identity of the homeowner who lived there. So not only do you see this in archaeological remains, but in the texts of non-Christian writers from the Roman Empire. These are non-Christians. These are simply Roman era people who talk about their own African identity and are remembered as Africans, even by Romans and later writers. So if you compare the Christian writers, some of the ones I mentioned, I'll do a quick comparison of some of the things they say, and maybe that helps illustrate, how they understood themselves to be Africans. So this is the non-Christian writer Fronto. Fronto will admit, he says, "I am a Libyan of the Libyan nomads," which remember, Libyan is what the Greek writers, and he's writing in Greek at the time, this is what the Libyans called Africans. He says, yes, I'm an African of Africans, as it were, which is a perfect parallel to what we said about the Apostle Paul. Yes, the Apostle Paul has a Roman name, but he is a Hebrew of Hebrews. Will Fronto can say something similar. This is another non-Christian writer. He's on trial, and one of the things he's accused of is being I don't have that quote for you, but he's literally called a half-breed from Africa. And instead of denying this or trying to be ashamed of this, he proudly accepts it. He says, I proclaim myself to be half Numidian, half Gaetulian. These are some of the tribes from North Africa, and the Gaetulians in particular are further inland in Africa, not along the coast. So Apuleius is proud of his African identity, and he goes on to win the trial. Now, Augustine, the Christian writer, will reference this non-Christian writer, and he says he does so because he's an African. So I'll read the quote. Apuleius, of whom I choose rather to speak, because, as our own countryman, he is better known to us Africans. So see, clearly for Christians like Augustine, something about this affinity with fellow Africans is important to them. They have an African identity of some kind. Okay, now this is a kind of a strange text. This is a dialogue that's taking place during a martyrdom. There are Christians who've been put on trial, and their leader is Galonius. So this is just before the time of Constantine, the year 303. I've just taken a few snippets out of it to illustrate the kind of questions that are asked. The governor or proconsul says, from where have you come? And Galonius, the representative of the Christians, the spokesperson, says, from the city of Nazareth. Well, this is in North Africa. This is Carthage. So, of course, the proconsul doesn't know where that is. He says, where is Nazareth? And Galonius responds, it's in the east. And here's the rest of the dialogue. But then the proconsul is very confused by this and says, but you who are African, how can you know Nazareth? And the simple answer is, they say, every Christian is a Nazarene. You see what they mean by from Nazareth is their identity is coming from Jesus. But then the proconsul asks a more precise question. Where were you born? Oh, now they know. We're born here in this town of Sabratha, which is in modern-day Libya. So you see, I think this nicely illustrates that a lot of Christians would first and foremost think of themselves as Christians. But that doesn't deny the fact that they are from Africa and can also speak of themselves with an African identity. So one of the key ways I think you can see this North African identity, even in these Latin texts, is when you look for this pre-Roman or non-Roman culture, and that's just meant to be a catch-all word for things you might find. So let me give a few examples of sort of things you can find when you look in these Christian texts that illustrate their Africanness. This is a Renaissance painting of Hannibal. That's not what Hannibal looked like, but it's supposed to give an image of kind of this scary general Hannibal coming from Africa on his elephant. The bust on the left is also an Italian Renaissance reimagination of what Hannibal looked like. This is actually an image of his brother on the right, of a coin that has survived of him. But whatever Hannibal looked like, what we know is that Hannibal was remembered forever by the Romans as their hated enemy. And Hannibal made his son swear to forever hate the Romans. So what does that mean when someone like Augustine would name his son after Hannibal, the Latinized form of it, Deodatus? Well, we'll see Hannibal kind of comes up in several different instances. The Punic language, I already mentioned that Augustine talks about it. We can see it in inscriptions. This is Punic at the top and the man's name in Latin at the bottom, Lupercus. So you find these sorts of inscriptions that show this survives throughout the Roman period, all the way into the Christian period, and even into the Islamic period. There's a man from North Africa, from what would be modern day Libya. His name is Septimius Severus. He's not a Christian, but he illustrates nicely what's happening at the time. Septimius Severus becomes emperor of all things. He's the first African to be an emperor in the Roman Empire. And yet, this person who writes his biography tries to compliment him. He says he had a melodious voice, but he sounded like an African somehow right up to his old age. I don't know what it meant to sound like an African, but he spoke Latin with an accent, seems to be the idea. Augustine will say that when he goes to Rome and then to Milan in Italy, that he's embarrassed that his mother, Monica, who's from Africa, always spoke Latin with an accent. But of course, he still loves her and is proud of her. Another strange thing that I'll just mention quickly is these Roman, if you talk about Punic culture that survives, when you look at Roman gods like Saturn, in North Africa, it's widely assumed that the Roman name Saturn is actually just replacing the Phoenician or Punic name Baal. and that if a Roman soldier walks up to this shrine, he assumes it's Saturn, and if a local African walks up to the shrine, he assumes it's Baal, because you could use either language to refer to this same deity. These two deities seem similar enough, and this shows up in other places. I'll go back to that emperor Septimius Severus. Here's a coin that has survived from soon after he became emperor, and he very shrewdly does not name the gods on this coin. He simply, the Latin says, "de patrii," the gods of the homeland. And the symbolism here is clear because Septimius Severus has inscriptions and he's built buildings in his own native North Africa, Libya, that are to these gods that are Punic gods, Shadrapa and Melkart. But they also have the symbolism that would have been recognized to Romans. This is the god of wine, Liber Pater, and the god of strength, Hercules. So it depends, which is right. Well, if you're Roman, you can see your gods here, and if you're African, you can see your gods here. This kind of thing is talked about by early Christians in their writings. The founding queen of Carthage is named Dido. I really don't have time to tell her story, but Augustine tells us that when they read of Dido's death, when they were children in Carthage, when they learned to read, they would read of Dido's death and they would weep. I mentioned that the elephant several times. This is from all the way around on the Atlantic coast. It's a Roman colony out there, and there are Christian church remains at the same site. This mosaic just illustrates how important the African elephant was in remembering Africans. This is a Christian writer. I mentioned him earlier, right? His name can't mean to lactate, but whatever this Lactantius fellow was, he's writing to a man named Donatus, which is an important name in African Christianity. It's not the same Donatus of the Donatist party, but he writes to this man who has been persecuted and survived. And here's what he says to him. How pleasing was that spectacle to God when he beheld you as victor, not bringing under subjection to your chariot white horses or huge elephants, but best of all, the very triumphant ones themselves. Now, here, what's so curious about that is why is he talking about white horses or elephants for this chariot? If you know your Roman history, you know that after every Roman general wins a war, he is allowed a parade through the streets of Rome. It's called a triumph. And he gets to ride in a chariot pulled by 4 white horses. Well, there is one particular instance that Lactantius has in mind. It's when the general Pompey had been fighting a war in North Africa, and he led his Roman troops into Africa. He was victorious. He brought back Roman slaves from Africa to show them off, and the Senate granted him a triumph. And Pompey decided he was going to be he was going to have the best, greatest triumph ever made. And so instead of having a chariot with white horses, he hooked his chariot up to African elephants to parade them through the streets of Rome. No one had ever done this before. Unfortunately for Pompey, he miscalculated. And when they got to the gates of Rome, the archway was too small for the elephants to go through. And so Pompey had to, in all humiliation, get down off his chariot and just walk through the streets of Rome, and his parade turned into a laughingstock. Now, notice that Lactantius can very subtly reference that here is an African Christian who has been persecuted by Romans, and yet he survived. And he's saying your triumph will not be led by white horses or even by African elephants, but by the triumphant ones, the persecutors themselves. They'll pull your chariot. And to me, what's so fascinating, additionally fascinating about this, is not just that Lactantius can reference this as an African Christian, but when you read this today in all the modern editions, I cannot find a single example where any scholar has made a footnote or a commentary or something to explain what Lactantius is talking about. So the average reader reads this in Latin or in an English translation and just doesn't realize that Lactantius is referring to a very specific scene from African history. But unfortunately, European authors have generally not picked up on this scene or chosen not to note it for whatever reason. Okay, I got to wrap up my time. I just want to point out that there is a lot of talk about the unique Christian doctrine that comes from North Africa. I just recommend a book to you by Patu Burns and Robin Jensen and several other collaborators. This is a great book as a resource, and the subtitle is key because it talks about all the different practices and beliefs and sacraments in North Africa and sort of what was unique about them. If you go back through those major writers I mentioned, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, almost every one of them has a rival in Rome and in Italy, and they craft their theology sometimes in sort of a very unique way that is distinct, and all of them are trying to be true to that African heritage, that African Christian theological tradition. So this is something that I just thought might be helpful if someone wants to pause their screen and look up further resources for it. But I'll be happy to share this if anyone has further questions. You know, places you can go and read more on this. And of course, at the top there is one of the best sources of all Dr. Bantu's books. So I'd recommend it as a starting place. And if anyone has further questions, I'd be happy to help with those in the future. And one last thing I will say, more scholarship is needed in this area. So I know a lot of people can read in this area and find it helpful for their ministry. Also, if someone has a calling to go into further academic work, I hope they'd consider helping us study this, because there's just not enough scholars working on North African Christianity or African Christianity in general. So you don't have to come to Baylor and study with me. There's lots of great places to do so. If you're interested as to learning where, I would love for people to contact me, and I would be willing to help them kind of find places that they could serve.
Thank you, David, for that presentation. Let me do this. Let me ask Vince a couple questions, and then I will skip to David. Vince, let me ask you to define some terms real briefly. First, I want you to define Egypt, and then I want you to define Ethiopia, if you would.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I would say that when we talk about Egypt, that's pretty easily defined. I mean, Egypt had like its own system of like dividing itself in nomes or areas that even before, you know, kind of the Seleucid and then, you know, like Greek and then later Roman domination. And they just kind of went with the ways that Egypt had divided itself. But it had been, you know, it's always been considered Lower and Upper Egypt. And, you know, which lower is in the north and upper is in the south. Then under King Menes, going back to like the early period, they were united and became one region known as Egypt. The name Egypt is actually an English word that comes from the Greek word for Aiguptos, and so this is also where you get the language, the last version of the language called Coptic, but the original land was called Kemet, and even in the Coptic language it's called Kemi, and which means the black land, referring to the black soil in the ground. And so that's, you know, and basically from the Mediterranean Sea to the first cataract of the Nile is the region that's known as Egypt. And then when you talk about Ethiopia, Ethiopia also is a Greek word. Ethiopios just means like one whose face is burnt by the sun. And that's not a name that the region we now call Ethiopia took on for itself until much later, like in the 15th or 16th century. But in the earliest years of the church, in earliest years of Ethiopian history, they called themselves Agazi. And that name also continued to be used a little bit in the medieval period, but it was the main name in the Axumite period. The capital was Axum, but the overall region was called Agazi, and it was also sometimes called Habesha. But again, it wasn't called Ethiopia. And in fact, Greek and Roman authors, that was a name they used, and they would use it to just refer to any dark-skinned person that was from like south of Egypt, or it would even include Nubians or in fact, the eunuch in Acts 8 is likely a Nubian and not an Ethiopian in the sense of being from Agazi, but the Bible calls him an Ethiopian, is just a way of calling him black. But also Indians, South Asia, and even Arabia are called, you know, Ethiopia. But if we're talking about the, you know, late antique period, Axum was basically just like northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, the regions that are now called like Tigray and northern Amhara. And then later in the medieval period, under kings like Amda-Seyon and Dawit and Yukuna Amlak, there was a lot more conquest. And so the empire of Ethiopia grew significantly during the 13 and 14 and 1500s. But going back to the early church time, it was a much smaller land region of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea.
I know, let me do this. I know you have to go. Tell me about your books before you leave.
Yeah. So I would say, and I appreciate, you know, Dr. Wilhite mentioned mine, and also y'all got to read Dr. Wilhite's books as well, you know, on North African Christianity. You know, mine do a very poor job of trying to summarize some of the great history and social dynamics that Dr. Wilhite was just breaking down. But yeah, for, you know, getting a sense of Nile Valley Christianity, and also even the rich Christianity in Asia that also was before colonialism, you can check out my book, A Multitude of All Peoples, and it gives a, you know, kind of an early history of early Christianity Christianity in the non-Western world with some missiological reflection. But also my book, Gospel Hymenode, explores, again, some of the things I was mentioning earlier about just from a Black perspective and engaging Black theology on issues of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And then also I have a book, it's more of like a evangelistic pamphlet called the Bisrat, which is an Ethiopian word that means the gospel. And that's actually free and downloadable on the Jude 3 Project website. And so, yeah, thank you very much. So it was a blessing to be here, and I'd love to be back.
No problem. I know you have to go, so I will be in touch with you. So thank you, Dr. Vince Bantu. He once again the assistant professor of church history and Black church studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, David, let me ask you a question. Let's talk briefly about Mark, the gospel writer. Tell us a little bit about who Mark is.
Sure. So, I mean, traditionally, he was the sort of assistant to Peter. One source says that he would translate Peter's message, and so thought to be the one who, this is where he gets all of his information as to what was happening in his gospel. That's the traditional idea. Now, there's also interesting connections to North Africa for Mark, because remember, it's Simon the Cyrene who carries the cross for Jesus. Well, Cyrenaica is part of North Africa. It's right between Egypt, and it would be part of what is sort of Libya today. And so the region I'm talking about, it would be included in that. And not only does Mark mention Simon, he mentions his two sons. And so there have been some scholars who thought maybe Mark represents some sort of connection with African Christianity. And then, as Dr. Bantu said, even later tradition says that he is the one who actually, after leaving Peter and Rome, he comes back to Alexandria and was said to found the Alexandrian church there.
Okay, let's do this. I got one more question for you, then I want you to tell us about the books that you have written and worked on. Let's talk about how central the importance of Carthage is to Christianity.
Yeah, so that region that I've been talking about, North Africa, or what the Romans would have called Africa, Carthage is the major metropolitan area there. So it's I mean, at one time it was probably the second largest city in the empire. And so it's just a huge hub of trade. The whole North African region was thought of as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. And so all of that was coming through Carthage and being funneled from there across to Rome. So Carthage is a major, for the Roman Empire in general, it's a very important city, and all sort of communication works through there. So Christianity sort of naturally worked the same way. Whenever there was a major conference of bishops in North Africa, they usually met in Carthage. The bishop of Carthage, he's virtually sort of the last and most important voice in all of these synods, right? He gets only one vote like everyone else, but he's sort of seen as the head figure in a way of really all of Africa. Now, at the same time, it is interesting just that North Africa is somewhat unique in that that map I had with all the different dots on it of all the known church buildings, they, instead of having something like a really strict hierarchy where you would have one archbishop over an area and then all the others would have to answer to him, North Africa was very decentralized in its church structure. So every one of those churches had its own bishop, and every one of those bishops was somewhat independent, would try to work together with other bishops, but didn't have a hierarchy over him, except for that sort of figurehead of Carthage. And then in addition to that, it's just simply so many of our sources come from there. The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, Tertullian's writing from there, Cyprian's writing from there. Augustine is not writing from there, but he wishes he was. He's made Bishop of Hippo, which is further west, but he's often asked to preach in Carthage, and he knows that the Bishop of Carthage is the highest ranked in his area. So yeah, it's just a very important city on a lot of levels.
Okay, tell us about the books that you've written and what are you working on? Yeah,
well, in this area, there's a couple books that might be of interest. I mentioned my dissertation started on Tertullian. So that actually, the dissertation was revised and published as a book entitled Tertullian the African. Unfortunately, it's with one of those academic presses, so it's over $100 for the book. Don't buy it. Just go to a library if you want to find out what it says. And then more recently, I've written a few books on various topics, but I think the one for this is the one entitled Ancient African Christianity. And it tries to be a resource that covers all that I've covered here. So everything from the backgrounds to African Christianity, and then what happened, who are the major figures and writers, and all the way up to the time of Islam, and even tries to tackle the question, what happened with Islam? Why is it that Christianity in this area didn't survive, whereas it did in Egypt and Ethiopia? And in each of those chapters, it covers like some of the things I was describing here, like what was uniquely African about these writers.
Thank you. David Wilhite is professor of Christian theology at Baylor University. He is also connected with the Contextualizing North African Christianity, the Society of Biblical Literature Conference, Society of Biblical Literature. Let's end with that. Tell us about that.
Sure. That's so the Society of Biblical Literature is a very large organization that covers, as it says, Old Testament, New Testament, even things sort of related to it. So several years ago, a few of us scholars who had sort of overlap in this area said that there's not really a forum for scholars to come and examine what was the context of North Africa. So we have an annual session now, which means you get several breakout sessions in the conference. So I'm no longer the co-chair of it, but I'm still an active member in there. And anyone who's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature can not only attend, but submit papers to be heard at the conference. And it's just a really great network. So people who work on Augustine, people who work on any of these writers, or people who work on certain areas of history or theology that overlap with ancient North Africa, this sort of creates a hub where they can work together.
Thank you, sir. Once again, David Wilhite, professor of Christian theology at Baylor University. And I want to thank him, as well as Dr. Vince Bantu of Fuller Theological Seminary, telling us about Christianity in Africa from Ethiopia to Carthage.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.